my first talk at a conference, so I'm excited to do this. I've been studying with Brian for the last 8 years. It's just been the most amazing joy of my life. And I think at this point, like whatever, there's ideas that are starting to synthesize within me. I'm glad that you're here and we get to dialogue virtually. So I wanted to start just by noting that it seems like the last 6 centuries, there's a very clear trend towards increasing globalization and we could say communion among humans, right? You were speaking to that so beautifully. That seems like that trend is unmistakable. And at the same time, there's this other trend that we see, which is towards increasing individuation, or we could say differentiation among humans. And that trend also seems totally unmistakable. In fact, it seems to me like in a way we could almost like define the modern period by those two trends and somehow their interrelationship. And so what I wanted to do in this talk was just sort of wonder with you about what the relationship is between those two trends. Because on one side, we could say we've never been more connected, and we could also say we've never been more fragmented. We could say we've never been so autonomous and we've never been so integrated. So yeah, what I wanted to sort of wonder about with you was how we understand the relationship between the increasing differentiation among humans and our increasing communion as humans. Alternatively, just in terms of language, I think we could talk about this as the riddle of sovereignty and integration, right? And you were actually speaking to that, right? That there's sort of, can we have both, more of both? Or the polarity of self-assertion and submission. And it seems like from one perspective, which I hear in Teilhard and also in Brian's work, is that these two trends are totally synergistic. They not only support each other, but they actually require each other. So the kind of communion that we're looking for in the noosphere is only going to come about through this sort of radical differentiation and the coming to be of individual humans as autonomous sovereign selves. So Teilhard says, quote, "Far from being mutually exclusive, the universal and the personal grow in the same direction and culminate in one another at the same time." And Brian says, "As we become the unique personality we are destined to be, we are enabling the noosphere to rise." So it seems to me just to begin that there's actually good evidence for this view. As one example from our personal lives, we can think about like how our romantic relationships work. It seems true in my experience that the more sovereign two people become, the deeper their communion can be. And on the flip side, without that sort of individuation, the communion that's possible is actually very shallow. So personally, I think we can see that like, more differentiation leads to more communion, and actually like the depth of communion that's possible in a deep friendship or romance can actually support more individuation. Go fly, go live your life, and so there can be a positive feedback loop there. In addition, I think my background is sort of in systems thinking, and I think among people who are trying to quantify complexity, they talk about measuring complexity in terms of how much differentiation there is in a system, how many parts there are, and then how deep their interconnections are, right? And so a system that has more parts that are more connected is more complex. And we can see, as Terry was saying this morning, that through cosmogenesis, there seems to be a very clear directionality towards more differentiation and more communion within complex systems. So unfortunately, it seems that there's also evidence for the opposite claim, that sovereignty and integration don't always align. For example, the interests of a sovereign nation don't always lead to a seamless integration with the species. When Obama became president, right, in the first couple months of his presidency, he said, quote, "The American standard of living is non-negotiable."
That wasn't Obama. That was Reagan. Bush.
Saddam Hussein.
I'll check on that. Okay. And at the next higher fractal level, the interests of a sovereign species don't always align with the interests of the biosphere. I think this one's right. American Secretary of State Rex Tillerson says, "What good is it to save the planet if humanity suffers?" So there's also, from a historical point of view, there's sort of the evidence from the last couple of centuries that there's so many sort of events in the world that seem to show sovereignty coming at the expense of a kind of harmonious integration, right? And Teilhard himself, in The Human Phenomenon, acknowledges as much. He says, "Aside from individual instances where sexual forces or some extraordinary common passion briefly come into play, human beings continue to be hostile, or at least closed to one another. Like a powder whose grains refuse to enter into molecular contact, no matter how compressed they are, they exclude and repel one another from the depths with all their strength." And in the centuries since this was written, I would say it's hard to argue that this trend has been reversed. So how do we explain this inconvenient truth? My sense is that in general, the response from those who advocate for a kind of synergistic view of differentiation and communion is that the form of individualism that we have now is malignant. And so the modern kind of individualism is pathological because it refuses to serve something bigger than itself. It refuses to serve others, and it refuses to serve the whole. In this sense, Ilya Delio says, "Separate, autonomous being contradicts evolution towards greater unity. Individualism opposes evolution." So, on some level, that seems right to me. I don't know how that sounds to you. Unfortunately, though, it makes it seem like the modern individual is somehow a wrong turn or a mistake that has to be corrected for the emergence of the noosphere. In this image, the modern Western individual is something like a cancer, right? That through its own kind of rabid self-interest is destroying the larger whole of which it's part. Happily, though, I think Teilhard and Brian also argue that this self-interested egotism is just a delusion. In truth, like Dr. Vollmick said, we actually are all interconnected. Our fates are inextricably tied. And so this sort of malignancy is just a consequence of ignorance. Teilhard says, "No element can move or grow unless with and by means of all the others as well as itself." So we could hope that once humans awaken to this truth, their efforts will naturally align with the larger wholes, right? We come to recognize, as you said, that we only exist through the whole that we create together, that we are together. In this somewhat similar vein, Joseph Campbell says, "The hero is the human of self-achieved submission." So I think it's certainly possible that this view is correct. Perhaps climate change will convince all of us that our fates are bound together and that we must act to caretake each other. And it will sort of give us a sense of our shared interdependence in a way that will allow us to overcome our self-interested egotism. But the reason I wanted to give this talk is because there's a part of me that feels concerned that framing of it misses some nuance that might be important. And I'm totally groping here, so maybe we can talk together about how this framing can be complexified. I guess my concern is that the problem with the modern autonomous individual goes deeper. than just sort of ignorance about its interrelatedness. And so as an entry point into that, I wanted to bring in the work of Arthur Koestler and his great book, The Ghost in the Machine. So in that book, one of Koestler's sort of starting premises is that the universe is made of nested holes called holons that are both holes unto themselves and parts within larger holes. And he says, as a whole unto itself, every holon acts in a self-assertive way. And in its dimension as a part of a larger whole, it acts in an integrative way. And according to Koestler, because every holon has these two faces, it's always acting both self-assertively and in an integrated fashion. In the case of a wolf, for example, he says, his self-assertive tendency is the dynamic manifestation of his uniqueness, his autonomy, and his independence as a holon. Its equally universal antagonist, the integrative tendency, expresses his dependence on the larger whole to which he belongs. So in this view, right, we have self-assertion and integration as sort of two polar dynamics pulling in opposite directions. And the job of every holon is to figure out how to balance those two. You could think about a cell in a body, right, is trying to survive as a cell, so it has its own sort of self-assertion. And it's also trying to learn how to integrate into the larger whole that it depends on for its survival. And right, the same is obviously true for us as humans. So Koestler says, on the level of the individual, a certain amount of self-assertiveness, ambition, initiative, competition, is indispensable in a dynamic society. At the same time, of course, he's dependent on and must be integrated into his tribe or social group. If he's well adjusted, the self-assertive tendency and its opposite, the integrative tendency, are more or less equally balanced. So I just want to note here that, right, in this framing, self-assertion and integration are described as, quote, universal antagonists and opposites which have to be kept in balance. And what Koestler says is that when this balance breaks down, disaster ensues. So if the self-assertive tendency comes to dominate at the expense of integration, you get something like cancer. But interestingly, Koestler says, looking back over the great cataclysms and disasters of the 20th century, it's not self-assertion that's the root cause of that, it's the integration. It's when people get swept up in sort of mass delusion of their integrated capacity that like the real evil happens, right? When ordinary Germans were asked, like, how could you have participated in this, right? Their answer was in general to say, like, I just got swept up in my integration to larger social whole. And so I think what's fascinating about that is that it suggests that self-assertion and integration both need each other, right? The corrective for too much self-assertion is more integration. But we can't just subsume self-assertion into integration completely. Self-assertion has to be the balance pulling back from integration to avoid things like mass delusion. So I think that within systems theory, there's good evidence for this more polar view of how self-assertion and integration operate. In complex systems, the sovereignty of the whole comes at the expense of the sovereignty of the parts, right? And Terry was actually speaking about that this morning. So, according to Alicia Guerrero, wholes create what she calls constraint regimes. And those constraint regimes create interdependencies between the parts that make only certain relationships possible among the parts. And so the parts lose autonomy, and that's what actually creates the system. Without those constrained relationships, there is no system. And Teilhard, in my reading, seems to acknowledge this. He says, from above, meaning from the level of the whole to the parts, every entity in the universe is, quote, subjected to the influence of unities of a higher order that encompass and dominate it for its own ends. So here we have kind of like two different ways of thinking about self-assertion and integration. In the first kind of synergistic version, self-assertion is like a tool that sort of furthers integration, right? Like the hero gives up his freedom or her freedom for the sake of submission to the larger whole. According to Kessler, I think, and to maybe this aspect of systems theory, there's more of a polarity. It's more of a zero-sum tension between self-assertion and integration. The trouble with the second framing, though, is that, like I said, it's zero-sum, right? And it naturally leads to metaphors of control. The freedom of the whole is opposed to the freedom of the parts. And so the answer is some kind of a battle between them. This leads to questions like, will the modern Western individual submit to global governance? And my sense is that makes the noosphere a hard sell, right? And I wonder if that's part of like, there's not a lot of young people here, and I think the language of like submission and the relinquishing of autonomy and sovereignty, it strikes young people maybe as unpalatable, or it's like missing something important. So I was curious to sort of just see if it would be possible to add some more nuance to this framework to kind of like just Okay. So one thing I noticed is that Kessler's framing treats the parts and the wholes as static and unchanging, right? So you get this image of like, there's a person and there's a society and they have different needs and they're sort of locked into themselves in the way that they are. And then the question is, how do they relate to each other? Which one's going to win? How are they going to share power? According to general systems theory, though, there's this idea that between holonic levels, between wholes and parts, there's all kinds of influences moving back and forth that allow the wholes and the parts to transform each other. Right? In the jargon, those are upward and downward causal forces. And so as an example, I was thinking about someone who becomes a parent. We could talk about this as sort of a situation where a person is confronted with a tension between their own individual self-interest and then their duties as to this new whole called the family. And we could say, parents have to figure out how to balance those different needs or find compromises. But it strikes me that that's not the way that most parents actually experience it. And I think the reason for that is that the new role, becoming a parent, it actually changes the person so that their self-interest becomes aligned with the interests of the new whole. So the reason that parents don't feel annihilated by their new duties is that they transform. They become people who no longer care about drinking 12 beers on a Wednesday night. And I think that the same is true maybe of someone who becomes a political leader, right? Like the idea would be that through this new responsibility, the person is transformed into someone whose self-interest is no longer simply aligned with themselves, but it's aligned with the whole. And then they're not balancing their self-interest against the whole. Those two things have become aligned. And I don't know what you guys think. My personal feeling is like, that's exactly what's not happening in a lot of our politics right now. And I think maybe more to the point, the same thing should be true of a species that becomes a planetary power, right? If we think about, how do we sort of balance our desires as a species to prosper and have comfort and all that against the needs of the biosphere, right? That's that kind of like static thing. And it seems like maybe a deeper, more interesting question is, how does becoming a planetary power potentially transform us as a species so that what we consider and actually feel as our self-interest is now aligned with that of the biosphere? So in this view, if humanity is pathological, it's because it hasn't been transformed by its new power. Not necessarily because it's ignorant, right? But because it hasn't allowed itself to be transformed. And so in this view, right, the transformation is guided by, and it also leads towards resonance. Through resonance, that is, self-assertion and integration become coterminous. In fact, I think maybe this could be a definition of resonance, right? Resonance is the force that creates alignment between these different nested levels of being. So like when a violinist is in resonance with her orchestra, her self-assertion, her individual expression is naturally attuned to and aligned with the larger whole that she's participating in. That's what it means to be in resonance. And I think what appeals to me about this is it gets us past thinking in terms of submission and domination. Right? The trouble with the modern individual isn't an unwillingness to submit. It's an unwillingness to be transformed by and for resonance. And from the other side, the solution to rabid individualism isn't domination or coercion. It's removing the obstacles to resonance. I think that, to me, that this frames the issue in terms of sensitivity instead of power. Along these lines, Kogi shaman from Northern Colombia says about the earth, quote, "If you knew she could feel, you would stop." And so the question becomes, how do we give ourselves the tools and the space to be able to notice the messages streaming into us from the larger wholes in which we participate? And how do we allow those messages to transform us? As a way to conceptualize this, we could note that in the universe story, Brian Swimme and Thomas Berry add a third term to the polarity of differentiation and communion. Inspired in large part by Teilhard, they add subjectivity or depth or interiority to form a triad. And my sense is that this depth is the place where the sensitivity grows, right, where resonant attunement develops. It's this resonant depth or sensitivity that allows differentiation and communion to enhance each other. So from one side, we could say, if you have differentiation without depth, what you end up with is this kind of shallow form of individualism that can't really honor or generate communion, right? This is the kind of individualism that can't feel its impact on anyone else. It's a form of narcissism or psychopathy. And from the other side, if you have communion without depth, then you have a kind of shallow collectivism that can't honor differentiation, right? That just tries to stamp out diversity or eccentricity. And there's lots of examples of that, it seems like, in our world also. So it seems like depth, the interiority, is this sort of like, it's this key piece that allows differentiation and communion to synergize. And so in terms of midwifing the noosphere, this suggests to me that subjectivity, is that 5 minutes? I think I'm gonna make it. Okay. So in terms of midwifing the noosphere, this suggests to me that subjectivity or depth is the place to focus our efforts, right? Instead of trying to coerce or lure people into submitting to the planetary whole, the task would be to assist people in, on the one hand, deepening themselves so that they can hear how the world wants to speak through them, or developing the internal sensitivity to be transformed into an agent of the noosphere. My sense is that this is actually quite consonant with Teilhard's own thinking. Right, he says, quote, "The essence of reality could well be represented by the amount of interiority the universe contains at a given moment." So before wrapping up, I think that Kessler's idea of the holarchy, these nested levels, allows us to add one more nuance to this vision. For Teilhard, right, like the primary kind of terms is individual human noosphere. My sense is that like complex systems theory suggests that there's actually a lot of structure between those two levels, right? Those two poles definitely exist, but between them there's the level of the tribe, the nation, the species, the ecosystem. And for the Earth community to thrive, all of those levels need to be in resonance with each other. So the polarity of self-assertion and integration needs to play out on all of those levels. And my sense is that maybe like one way to think about the role of the human is to bring more depth and interiority, not just to like our own selves, but to each of those levels. Can we help generate tribes that are deepened by a kind of self-reflective awareness? Can we generate nations that have that kind of reflective interiority, and ecosystems and a biosphere also? So my sense is that that kind of depth at all of those different levels will generate the resonance that allows all of these holonic levels to pursue both differentiation and communion in a synergistic way. And I think, in regard to what you were saying, that's what allows wholeness to coexist with individuality, right? So Ubuntu is not about the destruction or eradication of uniqueness, right? Somehow they synergize. So just as a final point, I think that this leads to a slightly different vision of the noosphere from the one that's described in the human phenomenon. In this view, humans are not a thinking envelope or a membrane or a corona surrounding the Earth. We're more like the connective tissue, maybe like a fascial system, that's supporting coherence and resonance between all these like vertically nested systems. Right? We're not like above and around the Earth, like we're right through it, not physically, but like in terms of all these levels of structure. I love that Brian says in his new series of noosphere that the noosphere is the nervous system of the planet. And that seems to me like a much better image than the brain. Instead of thinking of it as an envelope that surrounds the planet, from a kind of like cerebral over the top, it's more like a fascial ladder that integrates the different levels of the planetary body. In this sense, it's not really an envelope, it's a matrix that generates resonance. So as a final question to leave you with, I wonder if instead of surrounding the Earth with thought, might we as humans be charged with integrating the Earth's nested systems through resonance?
Wow. Well, everyone, we're 4 minutes over, but not because of them. It's because of setting up the technology. So let's go 5 more minutes with Q&A, and then there's plenty of food down there. We'll all be sated soon. So any questions or comments or insights or connective tissue? Keith.
Hi, I'm Keith Mesker from San Diego, and I got turned on to Brian in 2005 by Michael Dowd, who just passed away. And let's see. One of the things that Brian said was, if what we're saying is true, we need a deep practice to embody this. And I found that deep practice in 2009 when I went to hear Thich Nhat Hanh, spent a week with Thich Nhat Hanh, and fell in love with his teaching and the community. I was at this monastery where you could just see these monastics knew how to live with each other in loving harmony. And there were 1,000 people in this room, and young people are swarming into this Zen Buddhist practice, unlike what's happening in my church and all the other churches that I know about, which are aging out. And it was, one of the things that Thai said was, Thich Nhat Hanh is known as Thai, which means teacher in Vietnamese. And one of the things he said was, if you bring together 1,000 people with sick minds, they will create hell. And if you bring together 1,000 people with healed, well minds, they'll create a paradise. So this spiritual transformation that I think is about the intuition of wholeness, about this deep feeling of wholeness, and our ability to be so open that we allow everything in and allow ourselves to feel and resonate with everything that's happening.
Beautiful, Keith. Beautiful. Professor Leithold.
Thank you. I'm Wolfgang Leithold from Cologne, and I'm very much inspired by your presentation. I have a working group at my university that is heading to the same direction, and I have a publication coming out which is very similar to yours, but only 8 pages, sorry. And my question is, my current working group is with people of all ages at the university. Some are just 22 and some are 82. And we are facing the same question: what about global governance and other hindrances that holds us away from this kind of resonate, integral vision and action in face of our challenges of the time? So my question is very practical. Do you have a strategy how to make this transformation happen? You have any idea?
Thank you. That's a wonderful question. That seems like a riddle that we are here to caress together.
Yeah.
Right. I think it's it depends kind of where you locate the block to resonance, right? Like in some version of it, like that Brian has spoken of, you could say, oh, it's a result of the local mammalian mind, right? So it's baked into our neurobiology that it's difficult for us to expand our circle of care and compassion. Someone else might say, and I believe this, that it actually might have mostly to do with socioeconomic systems that make it so difficult to be generous or to care. And so I think maybe the conversation could start with like, what are the different threads that are blocking that resonance?
Right.
It seems interesting to think that maybe the resonance actually wants to emerge. Like young children naturally feel resonance with humanity and with the more than human world. And we're actively doing something to shut down the vibration, right? So if we could start by saying, okay, well, what are all of the factors? That seems like a start. I think the thing that feels kind of inspiring to me about this is that it can be an individual thing, right? Like the deepening of interiority. We don't need permission for that, right? It's like seeing a really moving piece of art or engaging in a creative project. You're an artist, right? Like you don't need a government to allow you to feel more deeply. So maybe the place to start that's sort of like simple is like, what does it take to help people know themselves and feel the world more deeply?
My idea was that we have to get away from what I call the anthropocentric ethos, which is a mixture of all sorts of ideas, habits, and stuff, not only ethics, and to look for an ecological, transhuman ethos. And I'm always, confronted with people who say, just forget about it. You know what human beings are. They are selfish, they are stupid, and they don't think around the corner and don't care for what's going on in 100 years. That's a typical answer to that. And my answer to that is always, if we don't start here, and we will be guilty of, sacrificing the entire ecosystem, the entire Gaia, the entire Earth. It's not a matter if we are successful. We have to just get started somewhere. And then see, it may take 200 years, it may take 500 years, because the obstacles that we have just mentioned, they have built up since about 2,000 years. But there are side tracks like Stoic philosophy, which is totally heading into another direction. We have to revive that. And we have to start now.
Arithmetic. When you get a group of half-wits together, do you add or multiply?
Let's
show our appreciation for not only that remark, but for the decades of work these two gentlemen have put in